On February 24th of 2022, Russia launched an invasion of Ukraine under the guise of a special military operation. In reality, this was an all-out war against its neighbor, whom it wished to bring back into the old Soviet-era fold. Ukraine, however, had no desire to be Putin's puppet, and the war for Ukraine was on. Yet from the very start, it seemed as if Russia did everything it could to not win the war. Does this mean that Ukraine is actually winning, though? The initial Russian offensive played out much as Western observers had expected it would, at least for the first few hours. Large missile and standoff weapon attacks against Ukrainian military facilities, troop formations, radar and communication nodes. A missile and aerial blitzkrieg descended upon Ukraine, which fielded a military a fraction the size of Russia. And yet, keen-eyed observers could tell, even through the fog of war, that something was not quite right with the Russian offensive. When the United States and allies launched Desert Storm in 1991, they were facing one of the world's largest armies protected by one of the world's most sophisticated air defense networks. In order to eliminate Iraq's ability to fight, the very first thing that the US and its allies did was destroy Iraq's air defense and command and control networks with an aerial blitzkrieg of cruise missiles and air attacks. Within 48 hours, Iraq's formidable Soviet-built air defense network was in tatters, and friendly aircraft ruled the skies, allowing them to devastate Iraqi ground forces. Yet, in the Russian invasion of Ukraine, which was expected to follow a similar doctrine, this did not appear to be happening. While Russia did strike against Ukraine radar and air defense sites, these strikes were very limited in scope compared to the actual capabilities of the Russian air and missile forces. In fact, it seemed as if Russia wasn't taking the war very seriously, or wasn't taking Ukraine's defenses and will to fight very seriously, or was displaying a staggering amount of strategic ineptitude, or perhaps a lack of tactical capabilities. It seems as if the truth lies with a mix of all of the above. It's unfair to compare modern Russian capabilities to even those of the US in 1991. For starters, the US had the help of many allies, and American equipment, training, and doctrine are simply superior. US investment in smart weapons far outstrips that of Russia, as does its investment in targeting pods for aircraft, special mission airframes, and tracking and surveillance capabilities. Yet, despite the disparity in capabilities, Russia, at least on paper, should have been able to launch an overwhelming and effective counter-force strike against Ukraine that would have been crippling to its ability to defend itself. It became very apparent very quickly that Russia was not devoting a large amount of its combat air power to the mission. It also seemed to be launching only a limited number of strikes with its stockpile of smart munitions, a stockpile that has always been significantly limited in size. When 2 planes fell out of the sky during the first 2 days of the invasion due to maintenance issues, the West started to get the idea of why large amounts of Russia's combat air power might not have been dedicated to the fight. While unconfirmed, there's a possibility that Russia's maintenance and logistics simply couldn't afford to support a large percentage of its combat air power at the same time. This, as we've come to find out, would be in line with Russia's doctrine of bluffing the West with the size and capabilities of its military. However, the truth also likely involves a significant amount of complacency on Russia's behalf and underestimating Ukraine's ability and will to fight. The first 3 days of the war saw a lightning assault by Russia's elite paratroopers on airfields around Kyiv. Within 48 hours, the assaults had been defeated by Ukrainian forces, and Russia's most elite troops were killed or captured. The assault was immediately puzzling to Western observers, who noted that there seemed to be the goal of establishing an air bridge to reinforce these assaults. Ground forces attacking south from Belarus might have been meant to reinforce these air assaults, but they were quickly mired down by determined Ukrainian defenders. Reinforcements were critical for the Russian air assaults because by their nature airborne or air assault forces are light infantry with no heavy vehicle support. At best, these forces can count on light infantry fighting vehicles and in some militaries on light tanks. While air assaults are great for surprising the enemy and seizing territory behind the front lines, they are incredibly vulnerable to rapid reaction forces which can easily overwhelm them, just like the Allies found out in Operation Market Garden during World War II. Now it seems as if Russia stumbled right into its own market garden with equally disastrous results. Russia had completely overestimated its ability to move forces from Belarus to the outskirts of Kyiv in time to reinforce the air assaults, even without any significant enemy resistance, and it would have been foolish to expect anything but heavy and determined resistance. Russian logistics are incredibly poorly suited for supporting operations far from railroads, through which Russia ships most of its supplies. With approximately half the logistic support for each unit that a comparable American unit would enjoy, Russia simply couldn't have advanced fast enough to support the air assaults. Next, Russia failed to neutralize Ukrainian air defenses around the Kyiv area, putting support aircraft in serious risk. Multiple transport aircraft meant to quickly reinforce the assaults were downed by Ukrainian air defenses, and a tragic loss of life for the Russians. The greatest failure, however, which echoed across the entire conflict, was the massive intelligence failure on Russia's behalf on Ukrainian capabilities and will to fight. Before the conflict, President Vladimir Putin had granted his intelligence apparatus millions of dollars meant to conduct operations inside Ukraine to determine the feasibility of an invasion. This money included funds to bribe local and military officials for either information or to facilitate an invasion. There's evidence that this happened to an extent. The roads to Kherson, for example, had been heavily mined as the Russian invasion was launched. And yet, when Russian troops got there, the roads had been cleared of all mines. The discovery prompted Ukrainian President Zelensky to fire multiple high-level officials. It has become clear as the conflict has evolved that Putin's intelligence apparatus didn't just fail in its mission, but it might have pocketed large amounts of the money given to them to carry it out, while feeding him false assurances that the Ukrainian people wouldn't put up much resistance. This is in line with what we know about the state of corruption in the Russian military and government. But evidence for this also comes from the fact that multiple high-ranking intelligence officials were jailed shortly after the invasion when it became clear Ukraine wasn't capitulating. It's perhaps this intelligence failure that could explain why Russia seemed to launch such a sloppy invasion with such low investment of long-range precision striking power. It's also likely why Russia made the incredibly poor decision of launching an air assault operation against Kyiv without having ground forces ready for immediate reinforcement. As the war developed into a grind, Putin maintained pressure on the Ukrainian capital with the hope of seizing Kyiv, killing Zelensky, and ending the war by installing a puppet government. However, this is where Russia was foiled both from within and without. Russia's advance into Kyiv soon became a massive traffic jam, reaching a whopping 40 miles long. But vehicles weren't simply stalled out due to traffic. Many had, in fact, suffered numerous maintenance or supply issues and weren't operable anymore. The infamous Kyiv convoy would show the world how thoroughly corrupt and inept the Russian military was, with evidence of cheap tires being used on multi-million-dollar vehicles. The money for proper tires having been naturally skimmed off the top by the unit commanders. These tires, mainly sourced from China and not rated for the size of the vehicles they were being installed on, soon went flat on muddy Ukrainian roads or simply wore out, stranding dozens of vehicles and creating massive bottlenecks. Simple logistics, however, were also to blame, with Russia proving it could no longer support a major advance deep into enemy territory. Once away from the railheads, Russian logistics depended solely on trucks. As we mentioned before, Russia has approximately half the number of trucks per unit that a comparable American unit would have. The further toward Kyiv that Russian forces moved, the longer the round trip between supply depots and deployed forces grew, inevitably slowing down the advance to a crawl and then finally bringing it to a standstill. The Ukrainians quickly identified this glaring vulnerability in Russian doctrine and made them suffer dearly for it. Ukrainian air and ground forces no longer attacked tanks or infantry fighting vehicles, instead ignored them and focused on destroying Russian trucks. This put even more pressure on an already weak logistics network which would inevitably collapse. As a general withdrawal was announced, many Russian vehicles were simply abandoned, perfectly operational, but without any gas. Russian troops also suffered from a lack of supplies, with many resorting to shooting dogs or cats or simply looting as they had no food. The retreat from Kyiv was Ukraine's first major victory, though truthfully it was more of a self-inflicted defeat than a Ukrainian win. However, the war in the east raged on, and here Russia was making slow but incremental gains. Yet, here too, Russian doctrine ensured that its military was not successful, as it should be against an inferior force. By the time of the Russian invasion, Ukraine's military had been completely transformed. In 2014, Ukraine fielded an unwieldy military still stuck in its Soviet roots. However, after the Russian annexation of Crimea, the United States sent hundreds of personnel to train Ukrainian forces to fight and operate like a Western military. The result would be a Ukrainian military so transformed that it caught Russia completely by surprise. By comparison, Russia's military is very top-down oriented. Orders come from above, and junior personnel have little to no room for interpretation, even in the midst of an evolving combat environment. Russia's lack of a strong non-commissioned officer corps also means that Russian units lack discipline and the professional control provided by NCOs, making them large but very unwieldy. The two factors combined make for a military that's akin to a very clumsy juggernaut. By comparison, Ukraine's forces encourage decision-making by junior officers and enjoy a disciplined NCO corps. While not as well developed as a Western military, the difference is staggering. with Ukrainian units showing an incredible degree of initiative and flexibility compared to Russian forces. The rigid inflexibility of Russian doctrine led directly to many defeats in its campaign for Ukraine, but none quite as high-profile as the utter disaster Russian forces experienced attempting a river crossing at Bilohorivka. When the first crossing was shelled by Ukrainian forces, the Russians simply attempted it again, at the exact same place. Predictably, they were once more decimated by Ukrainian artillery. That didn't stop them from attempting to cross the river at the exact same place multiple more times, all meeting with the exact same disaster. The crossings were an exercise in madness, yielding the exact same result each time. But Russian troops had no choice but to proceed with the same plan drawn up by some senior military leader far from the front. It's estimated that Russia lost as much as an entire battalion tactical group's worth of equipment during the attempts. But this river crossing disaster has played out across eastern Ukraine over and over again, with Russian forces showing a crippling deficiency in both command and doctrine. Despite this and similar disasters, the sheer weight of Russian forces continued to push the Ukrainian defenders westward, with small incremental gains until the stunning Ukrainian counteroffensive on September 6th. Planned in cooperation with the U.S. senior military leaders, Ukraine has now recaptured enough territory to send Russian forces in the north into a general retreat. It's the first major counteroffensive of the Ukraine war. And through a combination of brilliant deception, real-time intelligence courtesy of the US, and sheer guts and determination, Ukrainian forces have delivered a stunning defeat to Russia that nobody saw coming on February 24th. But the question remains, is Ukraine winning the war? Tracking Russian and Ukrainian losses is difficult because both sides have a vested interest in keeping those figures secret. However, open-source reporting has led to some estimates that are likely within the ballpark of the true figure. Russia is estimated to have lost right around 2,000 tanks, with many of them captured and put into use by Ukrainian forces. Estimates of captured tanks after the latest offensive alone is somewhere around 24, enough for Ukraine to equip 2 tank companies. If true, this would be about 66% of Russia's modern tank forces, not counting the 20,000 hunks of junk that Russia keeps in storage as leftovers from the Cold War. Although we have confirmation of T-62s being sent into combat in Ukraine, hinting that Russia's tank problems are reaching critical levels. It's estimated that Russia has also lost around 4,500 infantry fighting vehicles, or around 34% of its total force. 1,300 artillery of self-propelled and traditional type have also been captured, abandoned, or destroyed, or around 23% of Russia's total. 250 of Russia's most modern aircraft have also been downed, though this is only around 18% of Russia's total. Most important of all, though, after-tank losses are Russia's estimated 217,000 casualties, 54,000 of which are estimated as KIA. This is a quarter of the entire Russian armed forces. But that figure is deceiving because it's counting all military personnel. With an estimated 300,000 ground combat forces, this means that a significant number of its combat personnel are either dead or wounded. Losses aren't Russia's only problem, as it's widely reported that Russian morale is at all-time lows. Almost from the start of combat operations, Russian troops were exhibiting low morale, with one tank unit going so far as to run their commander's legs over as retaliation for the high casualties they took. Now, Russian morale appears to be reaching critical lows, especially in the north, where the total number of POWs taken is unknown, but some estimate around 3,000. Perhaps the greatest sign of Russia's weakness, however, is the fact that according to reports, Russia has ceased sending new units into Ukraine. After the defeat in the Kharkiv Oblast, Russia has begun a major nationwide recruitment effort to replenish its combat losses. While not yet announcing mobilization, a national recruitment campaign is a sign that Russia recognizes it cannot generate the manpower needed to secure its objectives in Ukraine. On the home front, though, the Russian economy is starting to show signs of serious weakening due to sanctions. Western sanctions have been criticized even amongst the West as ineffective. Yet this was only because Russia has used significant currency reserves to artificially prop up its economy. Those reserves are slowly running out, and the reduction in energy that Russia supplies to Europe, both by self-bans of Russian energy and by Russia deliberately trying to pressure Europe by cutting off gas flows, means that Russia's biggest moneymaker is now drying up. With energy sales propping up the entire Russian economy, the sharp decrease in sales to Europe has sent Russia seeking alternative buyers, and those buyers are now setting prices themselves. China and India are both buying up cheap Russian energy at prices they dictate, and then selling it for a profit internationally. By comparison, Ukraine is slowly but surely gaining the Western support it needed from the start. Western countries are now mulling over the decision to supply Ukraine with heavy equipment such as tanks and aircraft. The US has approved the training of Ukrainian pilots on the F-16 and F-15, and within 6 to 8 months it's all but assured that Ukraine will be flying Western fighters. Germany's mulling over a decision to equip Ukraine with Leopard battle tanks, and increasing calls from within the US might lead to an approval of equipping Ukraine with the mighty Abrams. So, is Ukraine really winning the war? The answer is both yes and no. Wars aren't won until they're won, and any number of things could dramatically change the situation for Ukraine. As some of the West experience Ukrainian fatigue, the amount of support for the nation could begin to dwindle. Europe is already set to experience a harsh winter due to energy crunches after being cut off from Russian supplies, and this could dramatically swing European opinion against continued support for Ukraine. Yet the United States remains steadfast in its commitment to Ukraine and seems set to supply the nation with even more advanced equipment. While Europe may and has been faltering in its own backyard, the support of the US alone may be enough to shift the tide of the war in Ukraine's favor. Russia, however, remains a significantly large, if clumsy and inept, military power and has not announced a general mobilization. Even a general mobilization is at this point unlikely to win the war for Russia, as it would take nearly a year to mobilize, train, and equip fresh forces, time that Russia simply does not have. At every turn, Ukraine has been underestimated, yet there's very real fear of overestimating Ukraine's ability to succeed. Its offensive in the east continues to be successful even as this video is being made, but that offensive succeeded in large part due to surprise. It's unlikely such operational surprise can be achieved again, and this means the war is inevitably going to come to a slugfest in which Russia is the heavyweight. Only continued and vastly increased support from the West can see Ukraine push Russia back to its borders, and as of now, Ukraine isn't necessarily winning, but it's a long way from losing. Now go check out why the US doesn't have universal healthcare and watch the US weapon beating Russians in Ukraine, or click this other video instead.